Okay, well, I think we're going to get started here today. And thank you all for coming to the first of the Summer Support webinar series. This one is going to be focused on the Device Enrollment Program, or DEP. There will be a Q&A at the end of this session. We have about 25 minutes of content or so to run through, but anytime you can feel free to put your questions into the Q&A, and we will have someone monitoring that chat window. This also will be a recorded webinar, so for the future you need to reference it. It will be available online as well. Getting started today, we will have two hosts, myself, John Applebaugh. I'm a Customer Success Specialist here at Jamf, and also joining us is Alex Pedersen, one of our onboarding specialists. Diving right into it, we're going to be covering kind of what is DEP, or the Device Enrollment Program. We'll be talking through some of the advantages of using this program as part of your deployment. We'll also be going through sort of the initial setup and configuring of DEP with your Jamf Pro server. Then we'll dive into being able to use smart groups and searches as well as buildings and departments as part of your deployment and organizing. We'll round it out with some additional considerations and kind of talk through some best practices that you might want to think about for your individual pre-stage enrollment. Again, at the end, there will be time for a Q&A, so feel free to send those questions over at any time. We'll get to them at the end, and again, this will be a recorded webinar for future viewing. So starting off, kind of what is DEP? You may have heard of this program or you've already started using it, but essentially DEP stands for the Device Enrollment Program, which is an Apple-provided provisioning program that allows organizations and institutions to quickly enroll devices and get them provisioned through an MDM server like Jamf. I've included a couple links here just to give you more information about what's required for the program, but suffice to say it has to be purchases made through Apple or through an authorized reseller. This can't be from a consumer website or a retail store, even Apple Retail. Those won't be eligible for DEP, unfortunately, at this time. If you do have more recent devices, those are probably going to be DEP eligible. iOS devices have to be on iOS 7 or later. macOS will have to be on Mavericks 10.9 or later, and the new tvOS Apple TV 4th generation has to be on tvOS 10.2 or later. And a reminder that DEP is not available in all countries, so if you're outside the US, I would definitely take a look and see what countries are available for DEP enrollment. Kind of talking about through some advantages of DEP, we actually have our onboarding specialist, Alex.
Thanks, John. So first thing we want to talk about here are some of the advantages of DEP, and for starters, just some of the enhancements that we can actually apply to some of the workflows now that we can integrate with the Device Enrollment Program. With DEP, we can actually think about provisioning in which we can construct a framework inside the Jamf Pro really prior to enrolling devices. A common term that you'll hear is zero-touch deployment. DEP is something that allows us to basically provision things in the JSS, get a framework in place, and that will actually be applied to devices as soon as they are opened up, go through their initial setup, and they will be then enrolled inside of the Jamf Pro during that initial setup. Once they get enrolled, as far as the framework's concerned, we can have devices become members of groups, departments, buildings, and then we can use those as targets for configuration profiles, applications, policies, etc. Having all that take place essentially automatically with a zero touch, meaning IT doesn't have to really touch the devices for that to happen. The iOS devices in the pre-stage can also be, well, going back to the setup assistant, we actually have an option to choose what we want to have as a part of that initial setup and what we don't want to have. So for example, if we want to have our end users put in an Apple ID in that setup assistant, we can choose to allow it, or we can actually skip it. As far as supervision is concerned, this is one of the key features that I think is one of the most important things with DEP, is we can actually put iOS devices in a supervised state without using Apple Configurator, which was previously the only way we could get that set up. Apple Configurator, if some of you are familiar with that, is requiring a physical cable to be plugged into a computer, and then we would run the Apple Configurator program to actually get it into that supervised state. iOS device pre-stages, we can actually choose whether or not we want those devices to become supervised, and that will happen on the first setup, and then any subsequent erases as well. As a subsequent erase, we'll put it back into that initial setup. So this just allows for a lot more options regarding the restrictions that can be deployed to iOS devices immediately upon enrollment. As mentioned above, we can automate groupings upon enrollment, so that's a way we can really do organization, inventory tracking. Just really opens up the opportunities for us to create these specific groups that these devices become members of upon a DEP enrollment. And there are some other additional features with iOS when it comes to DEP. Mostly we can do iOS upgrades to devices as a mass action. We can also do remote shutdowns, restarts, and with shared iPads, which is something in Apple School Manager, a new feature in education, with shared iPad, we can actually do logouts as well. So we can log users who are signed in with a managed Apple ID out of a device. When devices are in that setup assistant, the way that works is all Apple products will always reach out to Apple as soon as they have connected to a network with internet connectivity. This is going to happen whether you do a factory restart or if you do an erase. First thing they will do is reach out to Apple. Apple will recognize that device as being a member of a device enrollment program, and they will then redirect it to the Jamf Pro, and then with our PreStage enrollments, which John will be talking about in a moment, we can actually target exactly which device and which PreStage enrollment we want them to use to enroll in the Jamf Pro. Some other key features here in security is the MDM profile. Since we can put the device in a supervised state, just like we did with Apple Configurator, we can make the MDM profile unremovable by users. With user authentication, this is something that we can require our end users to provide credentials to an LDAP service, such as Active Directory or Open Directory, and that's just a secondary way of allowing another layer of security where we know that the users who are enrolling do have the appropriate credentials to do so. This also kind of goes back to the provisioning, because when we are connecting to an LDAP server, that is automatically associating that device with their LDAP credentials, so we can have those organizational units populate in the inventory of that device within the Jamf Pro as well. Lost mode, though, is not a requirement of DEP, or DEP is not a requirement for lost mode. It does make the whole thing a lot more enhanced, because as I mentioned before, anytime that you erase a device, no matter what, it is going to be put back into the Jamf Pro, be re-enrolled, and if your PreStage denotes it, it will also be supervised. Being supervised is a requirement of lost mode, so this basically provides a loop that you cannot get a device out of the ability to basically bypass that lost mode. Numerous restrictions to prevent access to the App Store, control app usage, preventing the renaming of the device, blocking websites, etc. Those are all configuration profiles that are related to security, again, that you can have deployed immediately after an iOS device has been enrolled. So, life without DEP. Basically, what were the options that we had before Apple made the device enrollment program available to us? Supervision of iOS using Apple Configurator 2. As I had mentioned, that is something that did require basically a physical connection of devices to a computer in order to get them into that supervised state. That's something that we can actually do essentially over the air now with the device enrollment program and PreStages. The user-initiated enrollment over the air, that was basically the only other way that we could get devices enrolled, especially with iOS outside of Apple Configurator, would be to browse, go to a specific website or to a specific link within the Jamf Pro that would get them enrolled, and they would not be in a supervised state, though they would be managed, but with some limited functionality and restrictions. PreStage options. What we can do with the PreStage now is we can create Mac users, both local and mobile users, and we can have naming of iOS devices take place during that pre-stage enrollment. And as mentioned before, we can skip those specific setup assistant. As far as getting users created and doing the naming conventions, prior to DEP, these were things that we would have to do essentially after the fact as either as a mass action or do manually within the Jamf Pro itself. And with the enrollment being available through DEP, when we look at imaging, that is something that is becoming a little more and more antiquated. And when we are able to enroll through DEP, this gives us, again, the option to do some provisioning. So instead of having these big base images that have all of our configurations and our software packages, all of those installed, we can actually use the DEP enrollment method, which will put those computers into specific groups out of the gate, and then we can use that as a means of being able to deploy what we want to it after the fact, instead of having it all baked into a single image.
Yeah, so as you can tell, there's definitely quite a few advantages to using DEP as part of your provisioning cycle here. And as you're going through actually getting new devices or setting up or resetting up existing devices, perhaps over the summer months as maybe school's been out for a while, you might be thinking about adding DEP to your environment. And the next couple of slides will kind of cover actually configuring that portion in your Jamf Pro server. The process isn't too time-consuming, but there are definitely a number of steps that have to be considered. Step one really is going and creating an account with Apple, either through Apple School Manager website or through the Apple Deployment Program website, just depending on your organization. Now, the process requires you to put in information about your organization, and there's an approval that happens with Apple, and that can take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, just depending on the time of year as well as what information was entered. The next part actually requires you to do some setup between your Jamf Pro server and the Apple Deployment Program website. There's a couple parts, but basically we're going to be downloading a public key from your Jamf Pro server and then uploading that to Apple. Apple will then provide a token back to you that can be uploaded into your Jamf Pro server. So as you can see, it's a download, upload, download, upload. Essentially, you can find DEP or Device Enrollment Program under your management settings, Global Management, and then Device Enrollment Program if you're logged into your Jamf Pro server. When you go to that in your Jamf Pro server, you'll actually see this, which allows you to either create a new or get the public key. Now, for the initial enrollment, you'll just need to get the public key to start with, and then we'll actually be taking that over to your Apple deployment website. This happens to be a connection with Apple School Manager. You'll see in the first step over there on the left, you have the option for adding an MDM server. Then you're presented with a blue option for adding that particular server to your Apple School Manager. The last step is actually naming that server, so typically this might be Jamf Pro server or just something for you to easily remember that this is in fact where you want those DEP devices to go to. Lastly, you'll actually upload that public key right there, and the last step will provide you with an option to download your new server token. From here, you can actually go ahead and start assigning devices to your MDM server if you like. This is where it's over on the left-hand option in Apple School Manager to do device assignments. You would choose devices by serial number, order number, or upload a CSV file. If you're uncertain of this information or where that order might be, I would definitely reach out to the reseller or Apple agent that you've actually worked with to purchase that hardware. From there, you'll be presented with the option to assign these to a server or unassigned devices. The last option of release devices is something you should not do unless you are considering completely removing DEP. From here, you're just looking to either assign new devices to that server, or if you need to move them between different MDM servers, you would do unassign. Going back to where it is in your Jamf Pro server, we're going to go back into the Global Management Device Enrollment Program, and then we'll look under creating a new option. Here we'll need to put in a display name, and then you'll see right there in red is the server token file. This is where you'd upload that token file that you received from Apple. At the end, you'll actually see this as a result. It's starting to pull in this particular information from your DEP account within a matter of minutes.
And one thing I want to add to this, John, is the information that you're seeing on this page. this is all being populated on Apple's side. Basically, this is kind of a one-way street of information. As far as the information you're seeing here, serial number, model, description, pre-stage enrollment status, and device assigned. That's all information that Apple has and is relating to the Jamf Pro through the token to let the Jamf Pro know what is available to be assigned to a device enrollment program pre-stage. There is a column for device and asset tag and pre-stage enrollment. You'll notice that on this page here that they are currently blank. Those are options that the Jamf Pro will eventually enter information for once the device has actually enrolled and we have that info there. I just like to bring this up because sometimes there's confusion with newer customers where we see this page and we start seeing devices, and sometimes the thought process is, okay, cool, everything is enrolled, ready to rock, and that is not the case. This is just information coming from Apple letting you know what they are aware of what you institutionally own and what you have available to assign to a pre-stage.
I think that's an excellent point and something that I've seen before too, where this is really just information that's Apple is saying these are devices that are available for eventual enrollment if we wanted to. They're not enrolled at this point. So to actually enroll those devices, you'll be creating what's called a pre-stage enrollment. This is found both under computers and mobile devices. On the left, you'll see there's the pre-stage enrollment option. On the right, you'll see the plus sign to create a new pre-stage enrollment. And just like many other things in the Jamf Pro server, you'll be presented then with additional options to configure that actual setup. Just an FYI here, if you're using computers, there will be some features or some settings that are actually imported from your user-initiated enrollment for macOS. This would be the actual management account as well as the quick add that will be used as part of the DEP enrollment. After this is kind of set up, the next thing that we really want to focus on is actually scoping that particular pre-stage.
Yeah, and with scoping, there are a lot of ways we can go about this. As I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about provisioning, that really does boil down to how we want to basically encapsulate these devices, what kind of group we want, so we can have a granular approach to when we are deploying our configuration profiles or applications, etc. What we want to do here, though, is after we have created the pre-stage enrollment, we need to take a look at that list that was populated from Apple. And one other key note that I want to make sure we're aware of is on this page, it's going to be even a more filtered down list of devices, because a device, whether it be macOS or an iOS device, can only be associated with one pre-stage. So for example, if we were already had a couple pre-stages in place with devices assigned, when we go to create a new one and click on the Scope tab, it's only going to populate devices that are eligible or available to be assigned to a pre-stage. So all those other devices already assigned to another one will not populate in this list. If you are trying to figure out which device is going into which pre-stage, and sometimes it's a headache trying to look through every single pre-stage to figure it out, you'll want to go back to the global management settings, and if you go to the device tab there, that is going to show you all devices and their associated pre-stage. So again, if you're trying to find devices, that might be just a quicker way to figure out where the device is, what pre-stage it's affiliated with, if you need to find that information out.
Okay, so basically at this point, if you've actually gone ahead and started enrolling devices, as Alex was kind of alluding to, if you might be looking to find particular devices that were enrolled through DEP, there's definitely a couple different ways that we can do this. We recommend using advanced searches if you're just looking to do an inventory search to find particular devices that are that were enrolled via DEP or some other kind of criteria. Smart groups are best if you're going to plan on using that information to scope out additional apps, profiles, or in the case of macOS, policies. Basically, if you have something where you want an app to deploy right after the device is enrolled, you could use a smart group with DEP enrollment as the criteria. So just want you to take a look at what this might look like. The criteria that we want you to use for setting up that search or that smart group would actually be enrollment method : PreStage enrollment. That is the, typically it's reported in inventory when a device enrolls through DEP. It will show the name of the PreStage enrollment. To select a particular PreStage enrollment, you would then enter it here under the value field. But as a tip, I would definitely suggest using the 3 dots or the ellipses to select. That will bring up additional options, and it will allow you to select existing PreStage names that have been reported in inventory. And just a quick FYI, if you happen to change the name of your PreStage enrollment, that will not automatically update the advanced searches or smart groups that you've created. So just be conscious of the fact that when you update PreStage names, they would also have to update any searches or advanced or smart groups that you've created as a result.
Yeah, especially with the smart groups, because if you're using a smart group and you're scoping, applications, configuration profiles, if you change the name of the PreStage, that means that that smart group is not going to meet that criteria anymore, and that will essentially remove all the members of that group and subsequently any of the configuration profiles and apps that were in scope for that group. Just want to reiterate that.
Yeah, excellent point. And I think it's just something that we like to hammer home because we are seeing more and more situations where someone has renamed a PreStage and then it's caused problems as a result for smart groups. So after you've actually created that advanced search or smart group, the results will look like this. You can view what devices were actually from that PreStage by clicking the View button after you've set up the smart group or the search. From there, you'll actually have the options to do an export of that data to a data file using the big blue export button at the bottom, or an action item. So mass actions can be done on smart groups or saved searches or your entire inventory when you're viewing it, and that allows you to do things like send remote commands. For iOS, this is particularly helpful. So let's say you had a smart group of all your devices that were enrolled through PreStage enrollment. You could then send a mass action to update their iOS to the latest version at a time of your choosing just by using that mass action button. Likewise, that we didn't cover as much, but I think it's worth noting is there's definitely an ability to leverage your existing network infrastructure to make it simple to organize your inventory.
Yeah, and with that, in addition to creating those smart groups that are based on the naming convention, essentially, of the PreStage enrollment, what we can do is, in the PreStage, we have an option for user and location. And for user and location, if we are going to be authenticating to an LDAP service, such as Active Directory or Open Directory, we can actually automatically have these devices become members of these of their departments and groups. Now, the reason why we have drop-downs here for department and buildings, if we are not currently authenticating to Active Directory or Open Directory, we can actually manually create departments and buildings inside the Jamf Pro. And with that being said, we can use the PreStage enrollment to automatically associate those devices to a specific building or department. So if we're in a situation where we are not doing anything with LDAP, but we still want to use departments and buildings as a method for either scoping items out or even just for inventory purposes, we can actually have that happen automatically through a PreStage enrollment.
That's great. I think that's perfect, especially for getting started with using DEP and getting devices enrolled. It's definitely helpful to have something set up on the front end so that it's organized ahead of time. So we're kind of getting to the final end of this presentation, but essentially we wanted to kind of touch on a few ideas for setting up your PreStage or things that you might want to consider as you are deploying your devices here. First, I'd like to point out that automatically assign new devices is a great feature on the PreStage, but it's only really helpful if you're using one PreStage. If you have more than one PreStage, checking that automatically assign new devices is only going to assign it to that one individual PreStage, which might make it more difficult to then adjust in the future if you need to move devices to different PreStages. Like we talked about at the beginning, we were talking about making things more secure and preventing users from being able to remove the management features that Jamf provides. There's options in that PreStage for make MDM profile mandatory. as well as on macOS, you want to uncheck Allow MDM Profile Removal. This actually prevents the user from going into System Preferences and removing that MDM profile. Likewise, we've touched on it a lot of times, but basically supervision for iOS allows you to do a lot more management features. Directly from the PreStage, you can set the naming convention, as well as you can preventing unenrollment, pairing with macOS, and setting up shared iPads. After it's enrolled, there's of course additional restrictions that you can do, as well as allow for remote updates to the iOS.
With the location services in the Setup Assistant, a consideration for that is you can use that to your advantage, again, for provisioning. So if you are requiring authentication, that is something that is requiring the device to authenticate with an LDAP service prior to it being able to log in. And when it logs in, then it will enroll itself. So the consideration on that is, make sure that your end users know what their authentication is, and they know what their AD username and password is going to be prior to handing them out, because that could be potentially a roadblock. The directory payload for macOS, this is what allows you to bind, so not just authenticate, but actually bind to the domain. One consideration is if we have this enabled, this can result in some increased enrollment time. When we are adding that additional function to take place, a consideration is some, extra time might be required in the initial for that to take place. And I think if we do a bind, your overall initial logins, after you've been enrolled can also increase the login times. So again, a consideration. For adding the account settings payload, the biggest thing for that is to remember when a Mac OS device enrolls, during the enrollment process, it is going to lay down that management account, which you will have defined under the user-initiated enrollment settings. The reason we put this down as a consideration is I've just seen it plenty of times where we take a look at a PreStage enrollment, they have the account settings payload configured, and they're basically setting it up as the JSS admin or the Jamf Pro admin, and you're thinking that that's what they need to lay down for the management. That is taking place during enrollment per your configuration of that management account under the user-initiated settings. So it's kind of a little bit odd that you would have to set something up in user-initiated, which is kind of a different method of enrollment, for it to work in a DEP PreStage, but that is how that management account does make it to devices in a PreStage, based on what you have set under the user-initiated settings under the platforms for macOS. So that's just a consideration.
Yeah, it's very good points, and I think there's definitely a lot of ways that you can do your enrollment, but I think this gives you some ideas of things to consider that from our experience that we've seen other customers engage with, that these things tend to work or be streamlined a little bit better by just thinking ahead about what these settings actually do and what you want to see. With that, I do want to thank you for attending this session. Again, it was being recorded. We're going to kind of switch it over to Q&A, but I just wanted to let you know that this is actually a series of webinars. We'll have one a month. Next month will be on VPP, followed by a webinar on tvOS enrollment in August. With that, we're going to take a look at our questions here. And the first question is from Ray, who wants to know, is there an automated way to associate managed Apple IDs to an iPad through a CSV file or another process?
Want me to
go ahead.
Tackle that one? Yep. As far as automation and using the CSV, we can use the tool called the MUT, which I'm sure if anyone here has used Jamf Pro for a while, you're familiar with the mass update tool. That can be actually found on the Mac App Store, and that is a tool specific to Jamf that you can use to update all sorts of entries in mass. But for automating the process, that is something that I would probably put in the user's hand. So if you have managed Apple IDs and your end users know what that is, During the setup assistant, I would not skip the Apple ID, and at that point they could put their managed Apple ID in to make that association.
Okay. Sounds good. Anne had a question on PreStage enrollment versus PreStage imaging for Mac OS. Do you do both, or do you choose one, or in what order? From my experience, these are two separate items. Your PreStage enrollment is solely focused on DEP enrollment. PreStage imaging would be setting up a imaging workflow to have any new devices as they come in go through a particular configuration. In general, it's not recommended to do both a DEP enrollment and an imaging workflow, although I know there are some customers that do. And there's definitely some reasons why they do that. I would say that in general, we want to have it go through DEP enrollment only, but if we had to, I'm not sure, what do you think, Alex? There's a preference on...
Well, just a way to kind of describe the real difference between the two. PreStage imaging, that is more of like a policy. You would set a trigger for those to be basically going through an imaging process. So you can have, you know, networks, subnets, and you can do things in order. So PreStage imaging is more of like a trigger-based policy, I think is more of an example. And if you look at a DEP enrollment or PreStage, that has one trigger, and that trigger is when a device is going through the setup assistant, either brand new out of the box or after being erased.
Yeah, definitely. I think...
Oh, and then one or the other, or in which order, pick one and stick with just one.
Yeah, it's like I say, it's kind of an unrecommended workflow to do both. I would definitely prefer to have someone talk with someone at Jamf before deciding on doing both workflows on the same device, just so that they understand the implications involved with doing something like that. A question that we had, what is the best workflow for removing devices from DEP when it is time to release them from management? I think this is getting at how do you clean up your DEP?
I think that question is, the way I read that is, let's say, for example, you have some DEP devices that you are institutionally owned and you're allowing your end users to purchase them. So you want to disown them. That is going to take place in the portal. And once you go in the portal, there was a drop-down or a screenshot that had a drop-down for actions you can take in the portal. There's assign devices to a server. One of those options was disown devices. So if you know the serial numbers that are being sold or are no longer going to be institutionally owned by your organization, you would want to compile all those serial numbers either in a CSV or in a text. You would then either paste or upload the CSV to put all the serial numbers into the portal. And then for your action, you would choose to disown. Now, the question that I'm kind of thinking in my head right now is on the Jamf Pro side of things, I think it would probably be best to first take them out of a PreStage. So if they're associated with any PreStages, just uncheck it. You would then delete those devices out of the Jamf Pro, and then you would take that action I just described, in which you would go to the actual app portal, whether that's school.apple.com or deploy.apple.com, and then disown them. And make sure when you sell it that it's really going to be gone and never come back, because I think there's some ways around it, but when you disown it, it's going to give you a big message that says you can never re-associate this device with this portal again. So when you have a disown, make sure it's a for real thing, because there's no backsies on that.
No backsies. So then the question kind of came through the portal here, but can I assign a device name to macOS devices in DEP during enrollment? And there's not currently a way to do that as part of a PreStage enrollment setting. It would have to be done after the fact, after the device is enrolled. There's actually a policy option to set the device to whatever the current name is in the Jamf Pro server. So if you rename your devices in Jamf Pro, you can send out a policy to then enforce that name on all of the devices that you have. There's additional workflows if you needed to make sure that every single host name and local host is the same, that we can definitely point you to as well. But essentially during the enrollment process, there's not a current way to rename the device. It's just going to be named however the device is currently named when it's enrolling.
Yeah, and I believe if you, during the pre-stage enrollment, if you are creating a standard user, after the next time that device updates inventory, it will be reported as that standard user name, '(S), and then the model. So, for example, if you had a MacBook Pro, it would be, and Johnny was the first one to create that standard local account, it would be Johnny's MacBook Pro.
I think this is a question that I get, and I'm often curious as to the answer to, but how long does it take to sync devices from their DEP portal to the Jamf Pro server?
I'll take that one.
Yeah.
So that is something that does happen, I believe, every 2 hours or 1 hour. But if you have just added a lot of devices, either through a PO or a CSV, you can expedite that to happen immediately. And the way you do that is a couple different spots. The first spot is going to be in Management Settings, Global Management, Device Enrollment Program, and then click on the link for the DEP account that you are looking to expedite the population of those devices. When you click on that link, at the bottom of the page there is a button that says refresh. That refresh button is not refreshing the page in the browser. That refresh button is refreshing the token. So basically it is syncing the token back to Apple and saying, hey, do I have anything else I need to be aware of, or anything, any new devices that are part of this DEP instance? So that is one spot that you can expedite it with the refresh button. Also, if you're in pre-stage enrollments, so, and by the way, the global one is going to be, for everything. If you are in a pre-stage enrollment for either mobile devices or computers, so you click on, for example, mobile devices, you click the mobile device tab at the top, you click pre-stage enrollment link on the bottom left, and that brings you to all of your mobile device pre-stages. Click into any one of those pre-stages and you will see that exact same refresh button at the bottom. Now, I believe that refresh button has the exact same effect as that global one did, where it's going to refresh everything. But since you're in the mobile device pre-stages, you're only going to see the mobile devices populate in the pre-stage that you're creating, because you are not going to be able to see Mac OS devices when you're trying to configure a iOS pre-stage.
Okay, I'm just kind of taking a look through a little more questions here. Question is, and I'm not sure what the answer is actually, is there a way to set up a specific icon for the Jamf management account? I think that's on the user profile on Mac OS, what the image file is that's used to associate to that user. Yeah,
it's, well, there should be a plist, or you could probably run a script to make that happen, but typically you would have the management account hidden. So basically the user folder would be in private var.
Right.
So you would never really see an icon for it on the login screen. If you did want to customize that, it should be just like forcing an icon for other users, which I believe we can do through a script. I don't think it's inherently built into the Jamf Pro. I have to look into that.
I think you have to, if you want it to be hidden, the file to be hidden, though, you have to set that as part of in the user-initiated enrollment settings, where you make the management account hidden.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay, what is the best way to move a device from one pre-stage to another? I'm thinking that's probably making sure that nothing gets lost or affects the device in any way or something like that.
Yeah, well, for best way, there's actually really only one way. Since a device can only be associated with one pre-stage at a time, the first thing you have to do is find the pre-stage that the device is currently affiliated with, go to the Scope tab, edit, and then uncheck it on the left, which will unassign it. That device will then be available for you to assign to the other pre-stage you want to set it to. as I mentioned before, sometimes it can be a little bit daunting to try and, sift through all of your pre-stages to figure out where that device is. If you're ever in that situation, you would want to go to Management Settings, Global Management, Device Enrollment Program, go into the DEP account that you are working with, click the Devices tab, because in this global setting, it's going to show you all devices and all the pre-stages that they are currently affiliated with, or that they're assigned to, rather.
Okay, switching topics a little bit, it's not directly related to DEP, but I guess since we brought up supervision a lot, it's definitely a good question at this time. So restricting iPads, if access to the Apple Store is disallowed, the App Store is disallowed, does this prevent new apps or app updates from being installed through app assignment in Jamf, in the Jamf Pro server?
It depends what kind of app it is. If all apps that you are deploying are managed, that you purchase them through the volume purchase program, and they are managed apps and deployed those apps through the Jamf Pro, then the App Store not being available has no hindrance on deployment or updating. If you deployed an app not managed, which you can do, you can go into your app catalog, which is mobile device tab at the top, mobile device apps to the left, and that is what presents your app catalog. You can click plus new and add apps that are not managed or ones that you have not purchased through the volume purchase program. And if you try and deploy those, or you try and update those ones, that is going to present a problem because they are not managed.
Okay, our next question is how soon can we enroll a device once it has been scoped to a pre-stage? So I'm guessing that means as soon as you click the add those devices into scope, how soon can you actually go ahead and activate that device so that it can go through DEP pre-stage?
I would give it about 3 seconds.
So pretty instantaneous is usually the experience, and if there are issues, then we might take a look at network settings and things like that.
The biggest thing is once you've gone into either an existing pre-stage or you're creating a new pre-stage, you're going to go under the Scope tab, find the device, and you're going to click the checkbox to the left and then hit Done. Just go back into the pre-stage again, take a look at the scope, and make sure that the device is showing as assigned. If it has a checkbox to the left and it's showing that it is assigned, that's the green light for enrolling it, and it typically happens pretty instantaneously.
Okay. So, we're definitely trying to get as many questions as we can. People are welcome to stick around as long as they like. We're going to keep answering questions. But this next question gets a little into kind of your organization of your pre-stage and making sure that it's set up ahead of time. But what is the best way, and that's very noted, to organize your pre-stage enrollments? For example, one for all, or multiple pre-stages, or one for students, one for faculty. I mean, there's definitely many ways to kind of organize this stuff. But what have you seen in your travels here, Alex?
Well, the onboarding program's main goal is not to, tell our customers really what we would really do in the environment. It's more of a collaborative thing. And the two big examples that we showed you today, using departments and buildings and also creating a smart group based on the pre-stage name, are two of the main ways that you can have these groups be created by the devices and have the device of members of the groups. The biggest thing that you need to consider is how much granularity do you need? Do you need to have, apps going to grades, or do you need to have them for grades and users, or do you need grades, users, classes, teachers? I mean, we need to think about all those different, I don't know, I guess we could say, granular subdivisions of granularity. And if it is a lot, we probably would go along the lines of creating that smart group with a pre-stage based on the name, because that is something that you can, at the end of the year, modify. So, for example, in a school environment, we would have a pre-stage that would be graduation year and grade. Again, there's many, many environments. This one would be a one-to-one basis. So if a student has an iPad, they're going to keep that from, grade all the way to 9th grade. We would put the graduation year of that user to start the pre-stage name, and then the grade that they're in. So come next year, if we had a smart group that was calling that pre-stage, we would up the pre-stage's name by just the grade number. So if that user was in 1st grade, we could change it to grade 2, and then the smart group would go to grade 2, and they would then go into the smart group of grade 2 and get the applicable apps configuration profiles deployed to them in a little more automated way. When it comes to the end of the school year, we just need to think about what do we need to have deployed to these devices in regards to apps and restrictions and just other configuration profiles. And based on that level of granularity, can we get away with it with just buildings and departments? Do we need to have a smart group that references the pre-stage name? If so, well, you're going to have a pre-stage for every applicable group you're creating. And yeah, I mean, it's a loaded question. I don't know. It's not a loaded question so much as it's a question that has many, many answers based on many, many variables across different schools. Higher education is a lot different than elementary, which is a lot different than schools that are doing one-to-ones compared to schools that are doing all shared cart-based. So many variables to really answer that accurately. All we can do is play around with it, try the different methods, test, and see which workflow makes the most sense in your environment.
And I would also add that there's definitely some resources you can leverage beyond this webinar for stuff like that too. If you happen to have a Jamf buddy, this would be someone you could find through Jamf Nation. Under your account, you will see the person that's actually your Jamf buddy. They can be contacted to kind of flesh out some of these ideas with you or kind of talk about what they've seen in other environments. I would also recommend looking at Jamf Nation. There's definitely a number of discussions out there, but I'm starting to see more discussions come up around how do I organize my enrollment for the next school year. I think these are good discussions to kind of engage with the community just to see kind of what everyone else is doing, maybe get an idea of other things that people have done, because at the end of the day, like the people that are on this webinar are not necessarily the experts on how to do every environmental rollout, but I would definitely take advantage of all the resources that you can when thinking about your deployment.
Yeah, the big thing with provisioning, building that framework, what you want to have in place and how you want devices to be configured in either restrictions or with what apps you want available to them right out of the gate. Yeah, it's a thing where if you ask a question like this, if you ask 20 different Jamf technicians or Jamf Nation users, you're probably going to get 32 different answers. It's really a matter of just knowing what options are available to you and just really sitting down and thinking about how you want these devices to react on their initial enrollment, how you want them to react on subsequent erases, which will re-enroll them essentially. And like I said, test. Always have a batch of at least 1 or 2 devices on hand that you can physically have in front of you. And when you're testing new things out, such as pre-stages and the smart groups, make sure that you are only scoping those devices out. And yeah, basically always measure twice, cut once. You don't want to put all of your devices at risk by changing a pre-stage mid-year, things like that, just because there are potential repercussions. And the biggest thing I can say is anytime we are looking at doing these provisions, just test it out, see what it looks like, see what the end user is going to see, and see if it makes sense.
think that's a good point overall for any kind of Jamf workflow that you guys are doing. But another question back to talking about DEP in general. So how do we utilize DEP if we already have enrolled our devices into Jamf Pro Server without DEP? So they use a different method other than DEP for the enrollment. Now they want to know how would they take advantage of what you get with DEP enrollment. And I think that's a little bit complicated only because DEP enrollment kicks off at the initial setup of a device, and once it's gone through its initial setup, it's not going to go back through DEP enrollment until that device has been wiped.
Yeah, just to kind of elaborate on that a little bit too. So in that scenario, you got a bunch of devices and you enrolled them using another method, and then you maybe just realized, oh, I didn't even know we had DEP, and then you throw the serial numbers in the portal, and hey, they're eligible, they populate. If you then take those serial numbers and you put them into your MDM server in whichever portal you're using, whether it's Apple School Manager or deployed at apple.com, you can actually go right ahead and think about your provisioning by setting them up with the PreStage enrollments, and that's going to have no effect on those devices at all. So let's say you know, you have a bunch of iPads and you're already enrolled them using a different method. Let's say you use Apple Configurator, and now you're nervous about, you know, maybe implementing some of this stuff because there might be some adverse effect, or they might lose apps or current configuration profiles. That will not be the case. So to answer that question about how can we utilize DEP even though we've already enrolled them, I would say the best way to do that is to verify that they are in fact eligible by throwing the serial numbers or a PO in the portal and see if they can be assigned. If they can, they will then populate in the Jamf Pro, which you can then assign to a PreStage, and I say go ahead and do that. It's not going to have any immediate effect, but the next time those devices are erased, they will enroll using a DEP PreStage that you've assigned them to.
Yeah, definitely. So that's a good answer. I think there's definitely ways that you can use the functionality of DEP without actually using a lot of the features just yet. So kind of relatedly, is there a way that we can use DEP for BYOD, so bring your own devices or personally owned devices? And at this time, that's not included with the DEP program. They have to be institutionally purchased. If you're wondering how a good way to kind of enroll BYOD, which is, you know, a different, definitely a different scenario than DEP, there's definitely a few ways to do that, but I would recommend thinking about doing enrollment invitations. This would actually send out an email invite to the end user, to their inbox. You could put in whatever email, so personal email, whatever email that they use, school email, work email, and then they actually get a link to enroll their device. That works for both Mac OS and for iOS devices. So definitely a nice idea for being able to enroll some of those devices, get them into a little bit of a management state since they're BYOD. But at this time, DEP won't be an option for that kind of enrollment.
Yeah, and I'd say too, even if it was current state, if we're talking about BYOD as, you know, the bring your own device actual service, that is something that we can't actually even scope anything to. So like a lot of the provisioning that we talked about today, you know, getting smart groups established and, you know, buildings, departments, all of that, when you have a BYO devices as a part of your Jamf Pro, that is essentially a single group that you really cannot do much subdivision on. Of course, this is another conversation where we start talking about the sites functions, but in reality, when you do BYOD, that is something that is kind of a group among itself, and so a lot of the provisioning things that we've talked about today would not even be applicable with BYOD devices.
I think that's fair. I think just take one more question since we're well over our time that we allotted for today's webinar, but kind of came from an initial Jamf Nation post, but we're thinking about doing DEP. What is the considerations for like networking, network ports? What kind of traffic is needed in order to have DEP communicate with devices that we have on our network?
I mean, if different environments are vast. I mean, network is just another layer to that. The biggest consideration for looking at ports and different types of environments, whether your Jamf Pro is being hosted by us, or if your Jamf Pro is going to be on premises, if your Jamf Pro is on premises, if you have a DMZ, if you have a clustered environment, if you have a load balancer in there, there's just a lot of factors to consider. The main thing that you would want to take a look at first, if it was on-prem, actually if it was hosted by us too, is in the admin guide, just take a look at the ports and just make sure that you have all the ones that are applicable to device enrollment or anything that is related to Apple open and pointed to the right service. If you're having issues with device enrollment program, so let's say you're unable to get the PreStage to be triggered during the setup assistant, or when it does get triggered, you're getting like an invalid profile, or the profile is just not behaving as it should. Given the vast amount of variables that could be included in that, I would just start with a support call, to be honest. Create a case, go into Jamf Nation, create a case under your account in Jamf Nation, detailing exactly what you're seeing. Make sure you take any screenshots that you can, note anything that you are maybe seeing in the logs if you've gone that deep into it, but provide as much information as possible about what is being experienced and get a case created. That would be my advice on that.
I think that's fair advice. I think there's just a lot of factors that can go into some of those inconsistencies that, like you mentioned, that you might see, and so it's hard to tell from the outset what exactly is causing that particular issue, if it's something environmental or if it's something with the particular setup of DEP. But given the kind of things that we showed you how to do in terms of setting up that connection to DEP, if you're starting to see devices pull into the Jamf Pro server, you can think that at least your Jamf Pro server is communicating with DEP, and you'll be able to scope. And then from there, it's a question of whether or not the devices are able to reach out and grab the PreStage enrollment when they actually are activated for the first time. So if you're seeing any kind of inconsistencies when doing this enrollment, I would definitely recommend contacting Jamf support so that we can definitely give you a hand in trying to figure out what's going on. Other than that, we'll, if there's any other questions that we didn't get to, I don't think there are, but if there are, we'll try to answer those offline as well. Again, this webinar will be recorded, and it will be available for you to view in the future or reference if you need to. But thank you so much, and I hope to see you next month.
Yep, thanks, guys.